The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Welcome to the very first analysis video. The first thing that you're going to notice about this series is that I'm not going to be doing video intros where I speak to my viewers and give them a few tips about this and that. This series is just going to jump from score to score as you go from video to video, so you can binge watch these and there will be virtually no interruption to your viewing except for the credits at the end, which you can of course just advance quickly to the next video once this playlist is complete. The second thing to tell you is that this video series is really not that much good to watch unless you have a big screen. Of course, you could be following along in a score of your own, so you don't really have to look at every single thing that I point to. You could just look at things on the page of your own score and be listening along on your smartphone. All the same, if you do have a big screen, you should use it, because that's just the best way. Then you can see my mouse pointer pointing different things out on the score image. Before I start talking about the notes on the page, let's look at the layout of the orchestra. Like I mentioned in the introduction, Holst uses the full forces that he's got. Organ and a full battery of percussion. All three of his non-timpani percussionists are going to be playing very martial, very warlike instruments. And then, of course, he's got the timpani, notice with wooden sticks, so it has a very military sound, just a very pinging kind of a sound. Now, I don't recommend that people score for wooden sticks. A lot of timpanists don't like them, but they will use them in situations like this. But, a very, very loud strike with a wooden stick on a timpani head can damage it. But you would have to think that the timpanist would know how to control certain effects like that, or just disregard them and find other ways of getting a similar sound if they needed to. Full percussion and the quartet of quartets, the four of each families of winds. Notice 2 piccolos and 2 flutes, rather than 1 piccolo and 3 flutes, or 1 piccolo, 2 flutes, and a bass flute. Bass flute really would not be able to compete with most of these textures going forwards. So 2 piccolos, though, that's very much in keeping with the somewhat quasi-military scoring here. One last note about these horns, and that is, notice the 2 sets of triples here. I have a video about this, which I've got the link on the screen right now, which just talks about how to deal with groups of 6 horns and 8 horns in Mahler and Holst and so on. Looking at very, very big scores gives you the guide of how to do this, and Holst uses a couple different strategies. One is just to have a group of 4 horns from time to time when the orchestra gets smaller. You have the 2 trios of horns. And then, of course, he's got 3 pairs of horns from time to time as well. All right, now let's talk about the actual notes on the page. So this is just one of the most iconic rhythms and entrances in all of orchestral music history. Tuck-a-da-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, wooden sticks, like I was saying, timpani, and it's doing sort of a G drone going through here, along with a gong, actually a tam-tam, that's being rolled. This is actually one of the main reasons why people say gong when they mean tam-tam, really, is they see this score and they say, oh yeah, that's the gong, but it really is the tam-tam. Nowadays, 100 years later, people tend to use the word gong just when they mean the Balinese instrument in particular that has like a big metal nipple in the middle of it, and it has more of a ringing tone, as it has more of a bell tone. Although it isn't quite a perfect bell-like sound. But the tam-tam is really just a big cymbal in a way. It scatters the actual pitch of the metal because of the annealing of the surface and for other reasons. So it basically is just like a really, really, really big, complex cymbal. So if you hit it, you will hear a little bit of a bell tone if you're really, really listening for it, but it's more just to have like a really kind of a percussive effect and a white noise effect than it really is a pitch. Now, this is kind of interesting to me, is the way that the harps are used. If we think about the fact that you want to avoid buzzing, right, where your fingertips buzz against a string that has been repeatedly plucked. If you pluck too many of these strings in a row at a fast tempo, and some conductors take this very, very fast indeed, then you get a buzzing effect as the strings which are vibrating, especially longer strings, these lower strings, have a tendency to have quite a wide vibrating character to them. I mean, it's something you can just try out on your own. If you've never noticed this before and you play guitar, you can pluck the lowest string of your guitar quite fiercely, and then you'll notice that the string itself sort of vibrates back and forth. It's almost like an animated piece of footage where you just really see the string on both sides of this wide waveform, and then, of course, like filling in the middle, going faster than your eyes can really pick out in single moments. And that is happening to the harp strings all the time, even at softer dynamics like this. Now, the way that Holst gets around it, of course, is to have two harps, both plucking the same notes, but in reverse octaves. So the effect really is that you hear one line of harp going da-da-da-dun, dun, 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 and the other one going da-da-da-dun, dun, da-da-dun, right? Now, there is some doubt here as to whether the harp is doing anything. Do you know what I mean? In a recorded performance where you've got the microphone right up near the harps, you're going to hear this. In a performance where the string players are not really playing col legno very loud, they're not using much force to the bows, you're going to sort of hear the harps. But really, there's just going to be very little effect, I feel. But it's still a really cool idea, and I give credit to Holst for using it, whether it really works or not. Finally, for this very beginning, the first two bars, let's talk about col legno. There are two different kinds of col legno. There's col legno tratto, where the bow is actually drawing across the strings, just like it would normally be drawn with horsehair on the other side. And this is an effect that is kind of more effective at mezzo forte with a little bit of pressure, and especially with like the cello. Now, the cello can do col legno tratto, but this is not col legno tratto. This is col legno battuta. So the strings are being beaten, literally, with the back of the bow. And really, people associate that with the words col legno so much that Holst is pretty much not even bothered to mark battuta here. Something to keep in mind is that Holst is basically copying Berlioz, who used this effect so very well in the Symphonie Fantastique. So this is not really a new effect. It had been used 80 years before with Berlioz. But here it has quite a unique flavor, especially with the way that it's presented with all the other sounds, all the other percussive qualities to the other instruments, and in being a drone that supports this slowly building theme. Okay, now let's talk about one more thing, and that is the dynamic contour of the accompaniment. You have this beautiful swell here, where the hairpins just have this big push and then a backing off. Now, one of the problems here is when you're rolling an instrument, and that is that the force of your roll becomes cumulative, and it's very hard to back it off. Like this thing right here, where you have tremolo lines and you have a reduction, that sort of means that you cannot really push the tam-tam very hard before you have to back off. In fact, you might even have the player like not even play and just let the tam-tam just sort of subside a little before they go back to rolling, because you'll get the same exact effect, because nobody can really hear the individual strokes. They can just hear the energy in the tam-tam building and building. So if you just basically stop pounding on it, then the energy will slowly build down. Or I've seen plenty of percussionists just continue to just sort of lightly tap the surface of the gong, and that actually helps control it, almost like putting your finger on a bell to a degree, where that will slowly or even quickly make the vibrations subside, make the tone of the bell stop humming so much. But it is very cool because it accompanies this little flaring in the theme. Then here you have a sort of a longer version of this. This could have been dealt with the same exact way, but crescendo, basically it's the same thing. Holst wants you to get up to mezzo forte and then diminuendo right afterwards. So this could have been done really with hairpins as well, but it's just a stylistic and psychological decision. All right. Now that we've looked at that scoring of the accompaniment, let's look at how the thematic elements are dealt with. This really is a wonderful sound here. You have horns being scored in the new style. So, in other words, when they are using bass clef, they're sounding up a fifth, exactly the same way that they would if they were on the treble staff. And that is the way that they should be scored in general. Nobody does old notation anymore. Everybody does new notation now, and there's a very good reason, and that is that if you throw an old notation score in a contemporary work and the horn player gets it, they are going to assume that it's new notation, and they're going to play it wrong, or they're going to be thinking, oh my goodness, this is just way too low for me, and I can't deal with this, and they'll lift their hand at rehearsal, and they'll ask you what's going on, and then you've just wasted their time and everybody else's while you answer the question. So, this is new notation. So this G here, or this written D, is actually a sounding G, which is the same as the bassoons. So it's very easy to keep track of, right? D is the same note as A, written A, and then these D flats, these sounding D flats are the same as this written A flat, and so on. So this is a very beautiful sound, and this is something that the players really look forward to. You often get horn players who are used to playing low horn, and they get a lot of these beautiful low horn lines in the Holst, and they just really look forward to them because this is just really their moment to shine. And playing along with the bassoons gives a beautiful, low, penetrating character. When you put that together with the contrabassoon on the bottom, it is beautifully resonant. Now notice this is a doubling here. The third bassoon and the contrabassoon are playing together, right, an octave below the first and second bassoon and fifth and sixth horns. Now when that happens, the and is doubling the same pitch as the horns and higher bassoons. So this very, very first thematic expression here, just 3 notes, has been widely imitated in orchestral film scoring. Essentially, they don't always have a bass oboe, and actually very often don't have a bass oboe at all, but just taking their low horns and doubling them up with the bassoons and doing just a little fragment of melody, is wonderfully evocative, and we're going to be running into many instances like this where you'll hear something that is just familiar. It's being used all the time in orchestral scoring for film scores. Now, moving on, same strategy as before. It's exactly the same notes that started here. Contrabassoon on the bottom, and then an octave higher, first and second bassoons, doubled by the fifth and sixth horns. Now, as it rises, we jump to treble clef, and it's just the same transposition as before. So this is up a fifth from this note, actually sounding A flat just below middle C, which is the same note as this. Notice here, it turns to a written pedal D, which is just G, right, the same note that is being held here, as the bassoons rise in a chorale. Those 3-part and 4-part harmony chords that can be covered by the span of one hand of the pianist in the original piano score. As that rises, we have the bass clarinet coming in, and this is just something that you have to train your consciousness to perceive. And that is, what is this? Well, it is sounding a whole step lower, A flat, correct? So that just means it's doing the same thing as the contrabassoon and the third bassoon. So you have a beautifully colored line. If you want to hear exactly what it sounds like when you have contrabassoon, bassoon, and bass clarinet doubling one line, it's just quite a thick, very scary sound, really. It's just, there's a certain coarseness to it. Now notice as the bassoons rise, they get to a certain point where they can't really keep going any higher. And that's where the clarinets come in, and they bring the line higher and higher. Now, while all of this has been going on, you're getting doubling of English horn and bass oboe. Now, it looks like these instruments are playing the same notes, but keep in mind that the English horn and the bass oboe, when they have the same note, it's actually a fourth apart. So essentially, these two instruments are playing just the top two notes of this bassoon octave and a fifth. Pretty much anything with the word horn on it, English horn, French horn, and basset horn, has the same transposition, which is just sounding down a fifth, right? So this is going to be this low A flat, and this E flat is going to be an octave down. So they are moving in fourths. Then here things get a little bit more complex with a written D flat, that's this here, and G. So it's taking over the bottom rather than the top of this harmony. And then the oboes come in and at an octave higher than the bass oboe. And by this time, the quality of the tone has become incredibly pungent with all of these double reeds playing very, very low. You have to think that written D is such a low note for all of the oboe family. It just really has a, not raucous sound, but a very nasal sound. So all of these instruments are going to be displaying that, even when it's being transposed, say in this case, in sounding G. It's still going to have that very, very earthy quality to it. Now, as it rises and is doubling the clarinets, it's as if this opening here on bassoons is just naturally lifting. It's something that's very beautifully done in terms of this orchestration. Don't just think, oh, well, this line that was taken over by the bassoons or started by the bassoons is being taken over by the clarinets and the oboes, and then you end up here. Not at all. I want you to think that Holst has started with a certain tone quality here, and he has found a way of maintaining it as it rises through the instruments, almost as if these were high bassoons, sort of like those tenaroons that Berlioz is so fond of, and he mentions in great detail, even proposing a tenaroon section in his massive orchestra, speaking of armies of instruments. And then he ends up here with this beautifully spread out quality. So this is one of Holst's favorite things to do here, and that is to have a major chord or an octave and a fifth, a beautifully resonant scored chord. Meanwhile, the pedal tone is just going on its merry way, so this throws in the conflict of a minor second, the G right above the A flat in this D flat octave and a fifth. And which is more than just an octave and a fifth. It really is a D flat major chord, because you've got the F here, that major third. And same thing here. C is F, right? So the horns are playing this F. Now, one last thing here is to talk about the way that these horns come in here, playing this big spread out D flat major chord with a stopped tone. And right at the very, very top of that, doubling the top note of the oboes, borrowing a French technique, by the way, are the muted trumpets. So you've got the high D flat being played by a single muted trumpet, and that is enough to just give that sinister rasp to the top of this note, doubling the first oboe and also the first clarinet. And it just really has this wonderfully creepy and yet somewhat military band-like sound. This reminds me in a lot of ways of the lesson that I just did on Lily Boulanger of her piece Pour les funérailles d'un soldat. Of course, I think that this orchestration is a bit more experienced and mature than hers. Pour les funérailles was really Lily's first piece of mature orchestration, so there are still a few things that could possibly be fixed or adjusted or worked on to a certain degree, but the aesthetic is really the same, and that is to impose the idea of a military band onto an orchestra in a very impressionistic way. And I see that here, very, very beautifully done. In the Holst, it becomes transcendent to the point where you just really don't think so much about the military band origins, the concert band origins of what's going on. But I think to the English audiences that this was intended for, they would have noticed that similarity immediately, and I think that they would have been emotionally moved by this music from the very first notes, from the very first bars. They would have gotten it. They would have gotten what this meant symbolically. So let's have a listen to this very first page. I'll play the music now as you watch the screen, and let's see how all of those elements are put together. Once again, listen for the combination of bassoons and horns, and then the way that this bassoon chorale mutates into a tone that still maintains the same sort of resonance before it ends in this beautifully snarly chord here. I really love how the trombones come in here, tenor trombone and bass trombone, and they do a little afterthought here. It's a little transitional bit of theme between the previous bassoon-dominant or bassoon-originating theme and these chorale trombones and trumpets to come. But it goes along perfectly with this very, very murky sound of the tam-tam coming out of the shadows and then subsiding again. You notice here that the violins have sort of sunk into the distance a little bit. Interestingly, Holst is saying only half. So basically half the sections of double basses and cellos. And of course, half the violins because we've just omitted the second violins and the violas. So what that means is that the harps are going to be more prominent, that is, if you can hear them at all, over even gently scored trombones. And of course, the timpani is going to become more prominent, and so is the tam-tam. So this little flare here has this wonderful murky quality, especially with a darker sound of the trombones, kind of more brooding sound. Not that I want to really get into the whole aspects of harmony very much, just as how they relate to the scoring, but I think it's very cool the way that it starts off with D flat, and you know your tenor clef reading, right? You know that the lowest line is a D, right? It's down a seventh from the center line of C, or the line of middle C. It's not a center line in the staff, but this middle C line here, so that is a D. So you should always think lowest note of the tenor staff is a D. And look at how this tenor staff is being used to score low notes, right? So you shouldn't be afraid of scoring the occasional low note in a passage of more centrally or higher located notes for your tenor trombones. In fact, what you're going to see in this score is that Holst really assumes that the upper staff of trombones are essentially tenor instruments. So the more modern aesthetic of having the tenor trombones, or the upper trombones, first and second trombone, play lower and lower, very, very low, snarly, forceful sounds going below the middle line of the bass staff, that is going to be a bit of a special situation. Here you're going to see more forceful tenor range scoring. And of course the bass trombone and the tubas are pretty much all that Holst needs for those lower tones. Okay, we'll get to them in a minute. So after this little introductory theme, Holst turns this into a bit of a chorale. Notice here that we've got the F on the bottom, then we've got our little A flat fourth, A flat and D flat. So instead of rising octaves in a fifth, as we saw with the bassoons, here we're seeing 6/3 chords, right? Basically inversions of major chords over this drone of G. But essentially centered again around D flat. So you have that wonderfully biting dissonance that's implied. Even when it doesn't have a very biting sound, it still has a feeling of uneasiness. Continuing on, the trombones are rising, and the trumpets are going to be joining them. And I notice something here, and that is that when first trumpet joins in with the trombones, if the player is really thinking about matching their tone, this will feel just as seamless as the way that we heard the theme rise through the bassoons and then into the clarinets and oboes. So that you'll feel this just as one idea, not as piling on with more and more brass, but you just really feel this as something that just rises from the depths and inhabits the space. You won't be thinking about the added colors. In fact, if the players are really listening to each other here, they'll maintain a more, not more trombone-like, but just that wonderfully rough, coarse feeling all the way through. And I like the way that the horns come in here and start to take over. Now, as the horns enter, notice that we have got naturale, right? We've got just normally played instruments. So here we have the other half in a normal mode of playing, right? So just normally bowed notes. And that's actually a good thing, because let's be honest here about the limitations of Col Legno. It is really a soft sound. And that's the only reason why Holst thought he could get away with these harps, making any difference whatsoever, is because his experience of scoring for strings showed him that Col Legno is actually quite a delicate sound. Yes, he could have the string players hammering away, and he could have marked mezzo forte and even forte, but essentially, string sections will often be playing mezzo forte or forte anyway at the beginning. The piano marking will be an implied balance dynamic rather than a dynamic for its own sake with the technique, right? So it really is a softer sound. And one of the problems I'm seeing with scoring is that with sound sets and with playback sound sets like Note Performer and the so-called 38 gigabyte sound sets of Sibelius, the perception is that that Col Legno is going to be a very brutal sound. Well, you're just not going to get that. You can mark them forte fortissimo, triple F, and you're still just going to get more of a clicking sound and less of a pitch. In fact, the more force you apply, the more you hear the overtones of the strike and the clicking sound of the bows, rather than that wonderfully rustling sound that you hear at the beginning. That's another orchestral tip that I could be writing about how Col Legno doesn't really increase that much in force with live instruments, but just catalog that, tab that in the back of your head for now, not to overdo it with Col Legno. In essence, the whole idea of using Col Legno in this very dramatic, cinematic way has been done, right? We're looking at the pages in which that idea was done. Now maybe it's time to move on with our ideas of what to do with Col Legno. But that's another reason why there are wooden beaters employed by the timpanists. And that is to get that same kind of more percussive stroke rather than a thumping stroke, the more normal sound of a timpani strike. This freeing up of the first violin means that it can jump in and add a string-like contour that's quite deceptive here. Holst is following Debussy and other people of that time, Stravinsky to a degree, in scoring things that sound like other things. And I'll talk about what that is in a second. But now let's get back to the way that the trombones are blending into the horns. Notice this: mezzo forte diminuendo, mezzo forte crescendo. What pitches are they playing? Here you've got an A-flat major chord, and these pitches here are E-flats, right? A3, E-flats coming in quite strongly below this chord here. So as these two A-flat major chords are basically fading out, and this low E-flat rises into another A-flat major chord, this time a 6/4 chord, rather than these straight A-flat triads, it will actually feel, when the conductor is taking the time to balance out all of these instruments, it will really feel as if it's A-flat triad going down to an A-flat 6/4 chord. So if this is carefully managed, yes, you will definitely hear the difference between soft trombones and mezzo forte horns. But if everybody is really sticking to their knitting in terms of their dynamic contours and their tone, then this will just appear to rise out of this, right? And here is an example of what I was talking about in the introduction. The horns playing triads and doubling each other so that they can compete dynamically with the heavy brass in a very beautiful way. This is Rimsky-Korsakov scoring, Rimsky-Korsakov philosophy if I ever saw it. You know, the idea of matching the sound of a single note in heavy brass with doubled notes in horns to get the same amount of force. And here I would say, yeah, that's crucial. With this type of big orchestra and eventually to become cinematic scoring. I would say, yeah, do that if you've got the horns. If you don't have the horns, there's ways of getting around it. If everybody is, once again, really thinking about the force that everybody else is playing. Now, what else is coming out of the mix? These low E-flat octaves. And these low E-flats here are basically just the top note of this octave here. If you haven't noticed already, tenor tuba has a treble clef. That does not mean that these pitches are what they look like to, say, a pianist or a flute player. Okay? They are sounding down a ninth, just like you might score for bass clarinet. And that is because Holst is using a band approach here, very much as if this were a euphonium part being written in a concert band. I think that he was not taking any chances here. He was probably thinking that this was going to be performed on a euphonium anyway, right? So his idea of tenor tuba here is the band version, rather than, who knows what. I mean, a lot of the Romantic composers scored for different instruments in different, very strange ways. And probably a lot of them would be happy just to receive parts that were scored, I'd say, concert pitch. That would be like the Ravel pictures at an exhibition where he's got parts that are marked for a tuba, but are actually for the smaller, lighter French tuba and rarely go very deep. It really is essentially a tenor tuba or euphonium-like instrument. But that is scored at pitch, right? So probably most tuba players would prefer that, but that's all right. They can read this. So here's your euphonium part, pitched in B-flat. So think euphonium in B-flat, which is going to be scored like a bass clarinet. And all of that long explanation is just as much to say that this is also an E-flat. It's the same exact note as this E-flat here, this sounding E-flat, written B-flat. So isn't that strange that you've got your instruments in F with a written B-flat that sounds E-flat, and then you've got your tenor tuba, which is transposing at a ninth, and it has exactly the same note, but written as an F. Right? It's just one of these things that you have to get used to. And with a lot of score reading, you'll just see it and you'll hear it, right? If you are reading along and looking at the page and just imagining it doing what they call audiation, which is just that Salieri trick that we see in Amadeus. And that's just something that comes with experience of having an inner orchestra and looking at a page and hearing it for the first time without having to have had an orchestra play it. So these octaves come out of the mix, and they actually sound way better, I feel, with these instruments going back to a natural form of bowing. And of course, as this heavy brass and horn chorale starts to emerge, there's just no way that the softer sound of Col Legno is going to compete, right? Because here we're getting to a real actual forte with the first violins freed up, as I was saying before. So that takes us to this spooky section right here, which I feel is like one of the first truly orchestral moments in this. So far we've had this pounding rhythm going along, not very loud for most of the time. And we've had wind chorales and brass chorales and everything else, a sort of a military band stand-in, proxy. But here is where you get into real, truly orchestral scoring. And when you listen to this and you see the score for the first time, you may be surprised to see that there really is only one line of strings here, but it gives the quality of being very, very juicy string scoring going along with the rest of this wind and brass scoring. And that's just because of the nature of hearing things that aren't really there, which is what I said I would come back to. And here it is. It almost feels like there are string octaves going on here, or even string chords, but it really is just the first violins teaming up with the first and second flute on this high pitch. And, of course, those same pitches being expressed in a quite different way. Notice D flat and B are only a whole step apart, right? So this is really C sharp going to B. But it's being spelled differently here because the implication is that you have a D flat major triad. This would transpose as a simple D flat major triad here, which is itself shifting over to a B major chord, right? So that's why we have D flat to B, right? It's spelled a bit more simply. Here, the implication is that it's C sharp major going to B major. Of course, without the central note of E sharp, that pitch is of the F, right? The actual F, not E sharp, is just being notated straight for the trombones here. And then this is, of course, in a quite funny sort of reversal. This is being notated, the simple B third is being notated as E flat on top. So it's kind of a bit of a reversal between the trumpets and the trombones in terms of what's being played. But here Holst is just spelling things in the simplest way. And he's also being influenced a bit by Schoenberg, who, used enharmonic spellings for different things. And yeah, you might do some sort of analysis into this to see whether or not changing around enharmonic spellings affects the way that players play leading tones or other kinds of things like that, and whether that puts the orchestra slightly out of tuning to kind of get a particular effect. But I don't think any of that is really intended. And I mean, I've done scoring like that myself, where the harp soloist was in 7 flats and the orchestra was in 5 sharps, and there was no perceptible problem with intonation. But this idea here, going from a D flat chord to a B chord, just has this wonderfully cutting sound, not just in the way that it's scored, but the whole harmonic idea itself just has just this wonderful edge to it, especially when it's being played against a G pedal, right? There's just these constantly thrumming Gs. And this is going to be quite a loud note here with the tam-tam flaring. You're really going to hear this, kind of sound coming out of the tam-tam. And once again, as it cools down, the tam-tam player may actually just let it ring without really continuing to tremolo very much or very hard. The tremolo may be used more to quiet it down than to just maintain a robotic sense of energy. What you really need here in this hairpin is to back off of the energy a bit, right? So that implies actually not playing it. Or double in restraint, triple in restraint, which you normally would be putting in the reverse with a crescendo. But back to the whole harmonic effect. This idea of going from D flat to B is going to be used in different harmonic contexts, but the idea of going from a triad in one position to another one that is different harmonic context down a whole step, but voiced differently against a pedal. He's going to be using that throughout this piece, and we'll see when we get to the third installation, the third and final installation of our study of Mars. Now let's flip to the next page and see how this continues. That same idea being repeated again and again. Now, it sort of speeds up the frequency, right? It has just one bar. Notice the bar starting in the middle on the 4th beat, right? So that it can push into the 1st beat. And repeating 4 times. Now, as this final enharmonic B major chord is being held by tremolo strings now, more and more strings coming in, and this pattern holding on its own with the now forte crescendo lower strings and this very dominating timpani and forte crescendo gong, this really holds its own. It really, really does. Now, the first notation of solo here is playing against that held B major chord, right? Coming from the euphonium or tenor tuba. So you have to think that this is going to be pitched. This is going to be a G down here, an octave lower. So it really does have a wonderfully coarse sound, and it's just a great bum 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 bum, which is answered. The trumpet's playing B major against the tenor tuba's pedal G fanfare here. Now, notice the horns are coming in because Holst rightfully does not trust. He does not trust that euphonium player to really stand out once the texture gets very, very thick. We have this B major chord in the winds turning into a more fanfare type of repeated rhythm that is just basically playing over the top of the trumpets and getting huger and huger. Now here, there's a tendency to almost to feel as if there are even more strings than are really there. Once again, it's just the beautifully scored orchestral texture here. So we have the G against the B major, and it just works really beautifully well. Now we could pick apart the harmony here, but it's actually quite simple and direct, with the oboes and the flutes doubling each other, English horn an octave below that, right? Because this is down a fifth, right? So this is essentially concert F sharp going up to a B, right? Which is kind of the same thing as this, right? It's just basically doubling the third trumpet part. And the trombones coming in and pushing. This is also very, very French. The idea of the trombones doing a background harmony and then just pushing into a harmonic peak from behind, with the bass tuba at the bottom, but just really a unique way of using tenor trombone here, with eventually all six horns pushing on that G against the trumpets and all of the upper winds pushing a B major. And this is a really great example of orchestral balance, of the force that the horns and the tenor tuba are pushing through, and especially also with the fourth trumpet. You know, they are pushing Gs, and then three trumpets and all of the winds are pushing a B major. Now, you will feel a more victorious sound to the B major chord than the persistent sound of the G. But that is all pushing towards a change, right? Finally, the music is going to modulate to a pedal C, right? And coming back to finally the dominance of the D-flat major harmony on top of that pedal C. But really, how much has really changed? The pedal has changed, because we had D-flat way back here, didn't we? So really, similar harmonies or the same harmonies are being used in different contexts and with different energies to achieve what seems like vastly different effects. Now, before we move on, let's just take a look at some of this scoring, and then we'll have a listen to the entire thing up to Figure 2. Carrying through some of this, the top half of the D-flat chord, F and A-flat, being played octave away from each other, and you can really hear these piccolos just screeching at the top of this harmony. A2 oboes holding down this D-flat. Notice there is no filler in here, right, except for the clarinets. So the clarinets playing fortissimo are enough to, this low E-flat doubling, sounding as a further doubling of the oboes here. So we just have the sounding A-flat and D-flat in the middle underneath these flutes, and that is enough to carry forth that. And then, of course, here, this is another D flat, and this F here is sounding an octave lower as well. And then here you can just see the whole harmonic context of these bars written right in the bassoon staves, right? We have a C at the bottom, we have a D flat triad on top, right? And this chord, by the way, is the same as this chord an octave lower. So this is an octave higher than this. And then just, a different voicing of that same chord. This F and A flat here is an octave lower than this, right? So you have that as a triple. And this is extremely effective, by the way, to use in resonance. To have harmonic thirds in triple octaves with the trumpet on the bottom, flute in the middle, and piccolos on top. It just has a screeching, paint-peeling sound to it. Third trumpet is doubling the oboe and the lowest clarinet here. And, of course, let's not disregard this beautiful high bass clarinet note, which is going to be, sounding down a ninth, it's going to be the same A flat. The bass clarinet is going to be doubling the first horn part. Now, while all of this huge harmony is going on, we have our new persistent pedal that's going on here. So octave strings, and all of this is easily achievable without going Divisi. Okay, so, and especially for the violas and cellos, because they've got, all they have to do is finger the third string and play an open fourth string. C octaves, no big deal for concert violinists, pro concert violinists. And while this was all going on, this E flat roll here turned to these very prominent pedal Cs. So essentially, the first timpanist had a lot of fun, but had a much more discreet part than this just punching entrance of the second timpanist. And notice the harps are nowhere in sight. They have pretty much packed it up and gone home. They are now going to turn on their smartphones, and they're going to pretend to be reading along for the rest of the moment and looking very, very interested in everything that's happening. But they are actually going to be checking up on Facebook and possibly even, dropping in on Orchestration Online and maybe giving some composer some advice right in the middle of the concert. You never know. Or maybe they will just open their little ebooks thing and catch up on Tess of the D'Urbervilles or whatever. And this is the end of the gong, right? That just is a big, big flare. And, will the tam-tam player pinch it off here and just really actually just, put their hand on the tam-tam and stop or will they allow the tam-tam to resound through 3 whole bars of 5/4? It just really depends on the orchestra and the player and the conductor and what they really want. The conductor might give the hairy eyeball to the percussionist, or they might just completely not even notice until they're sitting in the recording booth that the tam-tam player did not let go of it. But it really, I think that what it depends on is whether or not the sound of the tam-tam is just too big. If the sustained tone, if the tam-tam player does not very, very slowly bring the resonance down and then stop it by the end of the bar, will that be just too present? Will it distract from this hypnotic sound here? Or will it just be completely unnoticed? Or will nobody care? That's something for you to notice for yourself. And one last little thing, felt sticks. So we're going back to the normal kind of beater here. That would only be proper because there's just no way you would want to mark forte fortissimo on a timpani and expect them to play it with a wood beater without the timpani player just saying, listen, raise the hand. Listen, I can't do this. I don't want to destroy my heads. All right, now that we've gone over all of that, that was sort of an opus in itself, explaining all of this. So I'm not going to go back over every single element for you to listen for, because I feel like I've already done that. But maybe just a few things, and that is to listen for the tenor tuba entrance and how the horns insinuate themselves into it, and how the winds and trumpets push at the new B major chord. And also that wonderful trick of going from D flat to B major, how the shifting of those tonalities has a really beautiful edge to it, especially when it's pushed dynamically. All right? And just for the very slow mutation of the strings from col legno on the previous page to just natural bowing, and then with the tremolo coming in, playing this nicely spread out B major chord, with the seconds playing the fifth at the bottom and the violins playing D sharp sixth at the top. It's a really nice way to voice a full octave chord in the strings. So listen for all of those elements, and even for the way the bassoons start to hold down these bassoons and bass clarinets start to hold down these low Gs. All right, so those are all things to listen for. Now, let's give it a try. As we move on to the next section here, I want you to keep in mind that all the dynamics here are set to forte fortissimo from the previous screen, okay? So this is all incredibly loud, potent dynamics here. Things seem to ease off here a little bit with these hairpins, but that's really just more like the arc, the dynamic arc of these phrases. It doesn't really mean that these instruments are reducing down to forte and then reducing down to mezzo forte or whatever. It's just it's more like a romantic kind of a thing than it is a clinical thing, right? So let's just assume that this entire page here is just everybody playing very, very loudly, very, very strongly. And the first thing that you notice here is, to me anyways, is that the accompaniment cruises along, and once more, we see a little bit of acoustic prestidigitation, which is just, sort of sleight of hand, a bit of an acoustic trick. So just notice when we listen to this page, which we will pretty soon, that you've got your strings just chugging along here in these massive octaves, which are carried over from the previous page. And they're only being doubled here just by C octave trumpets, right? And then here, the timpani keeps chugging along with the double basses and with the trumpets trading off here, just to kind of save people's lips, really, because it's easier to play a smooth group of notes like this than just to continue to kind of plug away and plug away. I mean, it's actually not that hard. But it's nice for variety. For the variety's sake, is just to split it up and not have it become too, stuck in one group. But that's not the point. The point really is that these trumpets are continuing to plug away at the rhythmic pattern, trading back and forth, but, the strings drop out, and they are actually changing to these D flats, right? They're going up a half step. And the transition is so smooth that you might not even notice that the only thing that is carrying this rhythmic pattern anymore are just a couple of trumpets, the timpani, and the double basses, right? The power of the idea is so strong and the scoring is so clever that you just feel that the continuity is seamless. So
You can see the level of craft here in Holst's scoring. In terms of craft, he did everything that he possibly could. If you'll remember the radio program that I linked in the introduction video, he worked everything out on a 2-piano score, and he made preliminary suggestions as he wrote. So he was already orchestrating in his head. And he did not have score playback to sort of check his ideas, but he obsessively wanted to get it right. That didn't mean that he lacked a strong inner ear, that he didn't audiate as he composed and everything else. It's just that the task was so enormous, he was so busy, and everything else, that he took this approach of using his pianists as a playback device. So 2 members of the staff at the School of Music, or the Department of Music at which he taught. It wasn't a school of music, it was St. Paul's Girls' School. But anyhow, a couple of his staff members were quite accomplished pianists, and they would play back portions, and as he listened to it, he would notate on his score exactly which instruments went where, and that's why in some of the bigger scoring it really feels pianistic in terms of the layout, right, of like chords moving together in groups like these bassoons. But that was a level of craft. See, that's what I feel with that, is that he was just really applying careful, deliberate procedures to the way this would all come out, because he well knew, I'm sure that he knew right then and there this was going to be his greatest work of music, that it was going to be remembered. He probably had a presentiment that it was really, this was something that he should really respect, and just, it was going to be his life's work. So with that in mind, let's really respect how he was able to pull off these little tricks, right? Of just having of stripping down further and further the way that the accompaniment is being played, until these orchestral groups sort of marching to war, marching in battalions, just becomes more and more dominant in the music, which you'll see in the next screen. It just basically completely takes over, right? And this repeated pattern fluctuates into that new idea so seamlessly that you might not even notice that it's happened. All right, now let's talk about those battalions. So here you've got a quartet of tenor trombone, 2 tenor trombones, bass trombone, and tenor tuba. Now remember, reading up a ninth from the sounding notes. So this is A flat, right? So the A flat is the same note as this, right? So this tenor tuba is basically just doubling the top line of the trombones, right? So if it gets all the way up here to this E flat, which is the same note as this F, which is, not a very high note for the tenor trombone. Now I've had people who play euphonium tell me that they can like mimic trumpet lines and things like that. They can get quite high indeed if they want to. And in fact, that led to a bit of a dispute about the nature of the tenor tuba, because I was quoting textbook values, ranges, orchestral ranges, and I finally had to put in an annotation saying, look, these are textbook ranges. I'm not saying that the tenor tuba can't play any higher than a high B flat, a high written B flat, or anything like that. It just is, it's a forceful high note. So anyway, but old history. But I really do like this, the way that the tenor tuba doubles this top line, and it gives like this beautiful round tone. And so what happens is that when the horns come in, and they're essentially doubling what's going on here with the trombones, right? So once again, think of the D flat on the bottom, the F and the A flat on top of that, and then the horns an octave higher, right? So it's essentially the same harmony with just a single trumpet completing the chord, right? Once again, really think of Rimsky-Korsakov philosophy in the balance of brass groups. And just a lovely color, the way that the trumpets really kind of take over from the top of the trombones and bringing that heavy brass color into the sphere of the horns, and of course with this high tenor tuba, right? Sounding G, correct? Right. Okay, so, and that G is an octave lower than this high G here. This is kind of hard because it's so very blurry. The way that this is all written out. But this is really just part of a C major chord along with this, right? So these are C octaves with an E in the middle. So it's just a beautiful brass quality of color, right? And then as things descend, the trombones come right back in, and the bassoons are kind of taking over in a way, along with the lower pitched double reeds. They are not really dovetailing, but they are kind of filling in this hole here, right? And then as things get more complex, the horns come back in. So you have a D flat major chord here, and it is doubling the oboes right here in terms of actual pitches and the English horn. Now this is something that I feel is a beautifully powerful and not often used doubling in orchestral music. And I noted on it in the Rite of Spring study that we did. Here I'm going to note it again, and that is the doubling of oboes and horns. It just has a wonderful quality. Usually you think of oboes kind of sticking to themselves or maybe doubling with muted trumpets and having a wonderfully nasal quality, but here they have a wonderfully round quality. Now it's really the horns that are getting the color from the oboes and not vice versa, right? If you wanted a perfect blend, you would put the oboes out front and the horns in the back, sort of foreground and background colors, right? And then you would get a blend. So if you really wanted this to sound like a blended tone, this would have to be fortissimo or forte fortissimo, and this would have to be mezzo forte, right, to really get that perfect blend. And even at that, it's all perceptual, right? It's just like, what does it mean? But of course, the clarinets are also coming in here on those same pitches. So it really is, once again, wind band scoring, but very effective. Now, don't get me wrong, just because a lot of this is very deliberately scored in chunks, this kind of chunk scoring is really common to a lot of film scoring. So you should learn how to use it, how to score it, how to manipulate it, because even if you don't like to score that way a lot of the time, as a pro orchestrator, you might very well get a piano score and the composer says, look, just do this and make that sound big like Holst, right? So you better know how to do it. That's my thoughts about that. Okay, now while all this is going on, you have this little counter melody, bum 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 bum, right? Which I sort of think tails into this, da 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 ba da ba bum bum, right? So I just really feel that it dovetails into this. So really, just octave strings here, octave violins. Now the bottom note of the octave drops out, and these lower strings, middle strings continue on, basically playing along with the bassoons and so on, lower and middle winds. But the octave continues because it's being doubled by piccolos now, not just the flutes, right? And also by the first trumpet, right? So that completely fills in, right? It gets a much more intense harmonic contour. The overtones start to really shine through on this. And then the strings just drop out and give up, right? And then they continue along with the top line, da 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 ba bump, and and then continuing on to climb on and just really, really emerge from the texture here. So there really isn't a whole lot to explain about this. It's just really block harmonies. But one last thing that I will note about this, all of these harmonies aside, what's going on with the strings? The top line of what's going on in the winds, essentially, just like the top of the middle, right, which you could sort of say is being played by the oboe parts, with the flute and piccolo sort of doing the same thing above. So what is going on with the strings is that you've got the violas and the first violins in octaves, and then the second violin playing down a third. So, you get your harmonic thirds in there, and parallel harmonic thirds, which essentially is just kind of building on top of what's going on with the oboes right in here. And, of course, the clarinets are doubling the violas and the first violins. So that is enough to give all of these massed winds, these battalions of winds and horns, it's enough to give it a beautifully orchestral quality. That is just one of the toughest things, really, and that is to figure out what to do with your strings. When you've got all these really great ideas with your horns and your heavy brass and your winds, and you're just really building on that. Now, what do you do with your strings? Sometimes the solution is very, very obvious and simple. It could be just playing octaves, playing the main theme in octaves behind it. And those octaves, in this case an octave and a sixth, gives the entire texture the quality of strings all the way through. That goes all the way back to Wagner, and I think like also Berlioz and Weber were sort of anticipating that in a way in places. And that is when you've got this sort of mass of massive brass, especially, then really all you need to do is just push at an octave or even at a unison with the strings, and that quality will lend itself to the other instruments so that it sounds like you have a much more massive string section than you need. So you don't really need to have massive divises in your violins, which just basically weaken the impact. Sometimes all you need is just an octave, or, an octave and a sixth, adding together to bring out an orchestral quality or lend an orchestral quality to the texture, right? So let's see how all of that works. Going back to here, how the trombones merge into the horns, and the contour of the octaves being played here by the tenor tuba below and the first trumpet above, and how the trombones come back, how the winds fill in the hole right here that is left by the horns, how the horns come back in, however all of this climbs, this little counter melody here with the first violins, and how that all ties together by the end of the page. All right, think of those things. Now let's listen to it. One last page, which is really just an extension of the previous one, and then we'll knock it off for this particular lesson. This is going to take us all the way to this point right here, where you have a real solo, not just a solo line standing out from a tutti like we saw with the tenor tuba before, but you have a real, actual, honest-to-goodness solo with nice thematic material built into it, entering by tenor tuba, of all people. Now, let's not worry about that yet, but just to sort of see this as a natural ending to a big buildup, right? So we have a continuation, as I said before, of those battalions of instruments climbing around and doing their various little chorales massed together. I think the thing that is most notable here is that the organ has entered the picture. I didn't mention it before, I just figured that I would leave it till now. And we have that same idea of two chords that are a whole step apart that have different harmonic contexts. In this case, it is E flat major, right, going to C flat major, which, while they are notationally, they seem to be apart by a third. They are functionally just a whole step apart, right? Flats to sharps. What's very cool about this is that Holst is changing the pedal note there, right? So he's going G, A, right? Very, very rock bottom G and A here, doubled by contrabassoon, tuba, and double basses, which, that has just the most awesome sound in a tutti. So if you want to know what that sounds like, if you want a sort of a reference for that, that's this page, right? If you really want to hear how it sounds, because it stands out so well. And of course, it is doubled by organ right in this place, right? And then just climbing up B flat to C, right? As the whole harmony changes, this time to G flat, alternating with E major, right? And it's really wonderful how these little shifts of harmony here find their way into this tutti texture, right? And then that provides the impetus for this to climb up to this really, really massive chord right here, which is, basically a big old E flat major chord. Once again, which we heard back here. But just because the context is different, it feels like we're arriving at a new place, right? Other than that, probably the only things that are very new here is just to see how the organ harmonizes with the trumpets, right? And kind of takes away the trumpets actually help take away some of that kind of pipe organ edge to it, right? If the trumpets are playing along with it very forcefully, then it kind of takes that sort of those strange whispery overtones that you hear. It just makes it more of an orchestral expression, right? And don't get confused by our enharmonics, right? G flat and F sharp being the same thing. Then the pedals here are really just being set up by these beautiful low, this low doubling and tripling that I mentioned before, right? And it's really cool the way that the third bassoon comes in here and adds some weight to the bottom line of double basses and contrabassoon. Now, another thing that's neat here is the way that the timpani rolls push into the other tones, and there's plenty of time. This is the benefits of having two sets of timpanists. There's plenty of time for retuning or for trading off from pitches to pitches, right? And notice that there's an F here and an A there, right? So the F is the major third of the C sharp chord, right? The C sharp major chord. This is just basically just D flat chord, right? But when you put an A on the bottom, the context is more of a C sharp major chord with a minor sixth being imposed from below, right? So that's just or you could say C sharp above A makes a lot more sense than D flat major above A, because functionally, like, isn't A flat in a D major chord, right? So that's just the context that's going on here harmonically, and it's really the same thing here. This could easily have been an F sharp major to an E major chord, but B flat and the bass, right? Which is basically putting the major third at the bottom, the same way that it does here, the G at the bottom of the E flat chord, going to a C, and C being a half step above the B, right? So you wouldn't want to write this as a C flat, right? Or you wouldn't want to reverse either of these chords. They just work better, and also in terms of intonation, to spell them as simply as possible. So what does that have to do with the timpani? It's basically just that these pitches are easy to trade off and to embellish, right? So putting the G at the bottom of the C's, that is very, very cool. That kind of reinforces the third here, even though this is not a G sharp. It doesn't matter. The ear will hear that and just sort of put it where it needs to go in terms of its pitch. The same way that you had an F here. So anyways, that's pretty much all that there is to say about it, except if you want to pick this apart, this is just a wonderful way to write a tutti chord here. So you've got your E flat fifths, in octaves apart, and, going throughout, right? So you've got your oboes doubled by the trumpets, and then, of course, the flutes on top of that, and piccolos on top of that, same pitches. And the oboes are also being doubled by the clarinets, all right? And then the outside notes, the outside pitches of the clarinets are being doubled by the first and second trumpet. And then, an octave lower than that, we have the horns playing the same thing as the clarinets. And it has just this wonderfully bright sound. I think that is partially due to the fact that the strings here are going to be playing, a very, very punchy kind of separated sound here. And that's going to have like a marcato effect on the way that this accent is played. So it just really leaps off of the page. It's really just a beautifully orchestrated chord. So think about all of those things. It really isn't too different in other respects from what Holst was putting together in the previous page. And I will see you in maybe 10 to 15 days on Patreon, maybe a little bit later on YouTube for the next chapter of this study of Mars, Bringer of War.